Okay, so this is quiz one. I'm going to review the ones that I gave back. Now my general rule is if 50% of the class gets the question wrong, then that is a problem with the question or with the way I taught it. So I go ahead and give that back. So as you can see, this question here about oxygen and CO2 leaving and getting into the cell, 50% of you got it right, which means 50% of you got it wrong. So I gave back this question. So those of you who got it right, 14 of you got it right. Great job. But it did get back, so you did get extra credit for this. So the question is, oxygen uses blank to move from the interstitial space into the cell to be used, while CO2 moves out of the cell into interstitial space to be transported away. And you've got a couple of options here. Clearly the one that stands out is the filtration. Filtration is not used in this manner. Filtration is a pressure, it's a pressure gradient. We'll talk about that when we get into kidney. But that is clearly D is not the right answer. So you've got active transport, and then you've got the facilitated and simple diffusion. So active transport, the difference between active transport and the others is that active transport actually requires energy to get in and out of the cell, to get substances in and out of the cell, and no, that's not right. We don't want to use energy to get oxygen into the cell to be able to make more energy. That would be not a very good, efficient use of the ATP that we do have in the cell. So then you're down to two options, facilitated diffusion or simple diffusion. Facilitated means it's being helped by something. Facilitated diffusion uses channel proteins, and simple diffusion, the substances are able to get in and out of the cell through the cell membrane without any help of any protein or anything. They just go straight to that phospholipid bilayer, and that's exactly how oxygen and CO2 get in and out of the cell. So simple diffusion is the answer to that one. We'll continue on to the next question. Here, sodium potassium pumps create blank gradient that is vital to the function of nerve cells and account for most of their usage. So clearly many of you got this wrong, so I did not teach it well enough. So we can create gradients in the body, and gradients are useful for a couple of reasons, but what a gradient is it's an unequal distribution of something on one side of a membrane versus the other side. It can be a concentration gradient where you've got more sodium outside the cell than inside the cell. You can have another concentration gradient where you've got more potassium inside the cell than outside the cell. That would be a concentration gradient. You've got a pressure gradient where you've got unequal pressure on one side versus the other. So an unequal pressure gradient would be in our kidneys, and this is where we get into the previous one asked about filtration. There's a pressure gradient started there. So when we get to the kidney, you'll know more about what I'm talking about. But there's a high pressure system coming from our arteries in our blood system, in our vascular system. We've got this really high pressure coming from our heart into a very, very low pressure system in our blood, in our kidney. So that pressure gradient, it's going to help things move past that membrane because it's really high pressure on one side and really low pressure on the other side. So it wants to equal each other out. We have an electrical gradient that's created, and that's what the sodium potassium pump is. We want to have that unequal distribution of sodium potassium in and outside of the cell, and that creates an electrical gradient. We have more Na, or we have more sodium outside of our cell than inside of our cell, and because of that, the outside of the cell is more positive than the inside of the cell. So that creates an electrical gradient where it wants to equal that out, but it cannot do that until we get a nerve impulse to do that, and that's the whole function behind how our nerve cells work. And so in order to create this gradient in the first place, because it wants to equal itself out, we have to use ATP. We have to use energy and a sodium potassium pump to be able to get more sodium out to create that gradient. So electrical gradient is what is vital, and we're going to talk about that in week 4. But the electrical gradient is vital for nerve conduction, and really you're going to probably discuss it in we're discussing it in chapter week 3. We talk about muscle stimulation that creates that action potential that allows the cell to depolarize and create a contraction of the muscle. So electrical gradients use ATP. The next question that I gave back, this one here, epithelial tissue is avascular, meaning it has its own blood supply. I remember talking about this in the PowerPoint, probably went maybe through it a little too fast, so that's bad on me, did not teach this well enough. But epithelial tissue is avascular. Avascular, A in front of anything means the opposite of. It's like anti. So this is the opposite of being vascular. Something that's highly vascular or that is vascular has a blood supply. So epithelial tissue is avascular. It does not have its own blood supply, so it needs to get nutrition to maintain the lining from somewhere else. We talked about this in week 2 when we talked about integumentary system in our skin. That epidermal layer of our skin has no blood supply, and a lot of you got the question about the road rash wrong because maybe you forgot this fact. And like clearly I said, I did not teach this well enough. So if something is avascular, it has no blood supply. The epidermal tissue of our integumentary system is epithelial tissue. It is avascular, it has no blood supply. Hope that clears that up. And also when we get into the joints, you'll talk about how the cartilage and the bones are also avascular. So when we have a synovial joint, that synovial membrane has to provide nutrition to that area of the cartilage. So anyway, this one here. These are all examples of connective tissue, with the exception of and we have 4 types of tissue. I hope you can remember what the types of tissue are. We have epithelial tissue being 1, nervous tissue being 2, muscular tissue being 3, and connective tissue being 4. So if we have choices between these types of connective tissue, muscle itself is a whole nother type of tissue. Therefore, it cannot be a connective tissue. Adipose, blood, and bone are all examples of connective tissue. But like I said, epithelial, nervous, muscle, connective tissue. Muscle is its own category of a type of tissue. Therefore, it cannot be connective tissue. So those are the ones I gave back for quiz 1. Let me go up to quiz 2. And we will talk about the ones I gave back there. I gave back 3 questions here. And all 3 of them were ones that I wrote myself. So clearly that's not, maybe it's a bad question or I wasn't clear on what I was asking for. The first one is this one. You arrive on the scene of an accident. The motorcyclist is standing along the side of the road with no reported injuries. Upon assessment, you find an area on his arm with minor quote-unquote road rash and a small amount of blood. That's the key there. You know the injury has to be at least to what layer of skin. And I just talked about it in that previous quiz, how epithelial tissue is avascular. We talked about the different layers of skin. We've got the hypodermis, dermis, and epidermis. Hypodermis being that really low to the muscle, it's got some fat in it. The dermal layer is really vascular. It's got your hair follicle, it's got muscles in there, it's got nerve tissue in there. It's got a very, very good blood supply. Then we talked about that epidermal layer. We did not get into the different stratum. There's 4 to 5 different stratum in that epidermal layer, and I did not get into that specifically. I maybe touched on it just a bit in the lecture, but stratum, anything labeled as stratum, is part of the epidermal layer. So we already talked about the epidermal being avascular. So if the epidermal layer is avascular, you have to get into the very vascular dermal layer in order to get blood. So if you cut your finger and you don't get any blood, you did not hit the dermal layer. If you cut your finger and you got a small amount of blood, then you probably hit at least the dermal layer, at least. So if you hit blood, you're at least at the dermal layer. Stratum granulosum, stratum corneum, and stratum basale, these are all layers within the epidermis, therefore it will not bleed. So I hope that clears that up. The next question here is, and I gave points back for already, so it's hard to see who answered what, but the possible first and second degree burns, I believe everybody got that right. It's the playing football and drinking alcohol one that got people confused. So, playing football makes you sweat. Sweat makes you lose electrolytes and water. So you get dehydrated and you lose a lot of electrolytes onto your skin through that process. Drinking alcohol leads to dehydration because it's a very, very effective diuretic. So you'll get more dehydrated the more alcohol you actually drink, which I can see how therefore can lead into electrolyte abnormalities. So like I said, this is a poorly written question, so I'm not going to hold you accountable for that. If you got this right, yay on you, you're probably reading my mind, but I know that a majority of you got this wrong. So drinking alcohol, although it will lead to electrolyte abnormalities, what I was going for there was dehydration, and playing football makes you sweat. Sweating makes you lose electrolytes. And also gets you dehydrated. Attracting the opposite sex and looking cool on the beach. None of you fell for my distractors. I don't think they're very good distractors. That was my attempt at being funny. Okay, we'll get into the meth lab explosion. I don't know why I chose to do a meth lab. It could have been anything. You could have been cooking hot dogs for all I care. Regardless of what this is, somebody got burned, and they got burned on their thorax and their right arm. Now I can't draw on this screen, but if you can imagine the anterior thorax, I'm not sure what where the confusion on this was, but I think what happened was that you guys were counting, most of you, let's see, 50% of you got it right, so I guess the other 50% of you, the ones who got it wrong, majority of you who got it wrong, I think we're thinking that the thorax is 9%, and the arm being at 9%, making it 18. But the thorax actually is such a large area that we do half of the thorax is 9. So upper thorax, or maybe the left thorax versus the right thorax. So I think that's where the confusion was. The thorax actually counts as 18. So the anterior thorax would be 18, the posterior and thorax would be another 18. So I hope that clears that up a little bit. Some of you said 36. I'm not exactly sure where that came from. I'm possibly thinking that you thought maybe the thorax was worth more than 18%. I'm not sure. Or you just randomly guessing. But the thorax total is 18. Right arm would be another 9. So that would be 27%. The other question, I think that's it. I think that was it. 1, 2, 3. That was the 3 questions I gave back. Other ones you guys all did pretty well on. Pretty pleased with the results of this quiz. I think you guys did. Oh no, there's another one. I don't think I caught this. Now that I'm scrolling through it, I think I have to give this question back too. I'll have to go in there and give this question back too. Okay, so since we're on the topic, I might as well discuss it. Blank, we're talking about either osteoclasts or osteoblasts. Somethings are responsible for bone formation and are found in growing portions of bone, while the other one, the opposite of it, are responsible for bone resorption and are located in bone surfaces of areas of old bone, injured or unneeded bone. And so one thing that I always got confused on was osteoblast, osteoclast, and that's why I included it here. And in my PowerPoint, I kind of went over how I remember which one's which. So the osteoblasts, it sounds like they're blasting something, which would be destruction, which is exactly opposite of what they do. So I don't know if that helps. Osteoblasts, they do not blast. They build. B for build. B for build. And osteoclasts, the C, I just think of recycle. Recycle. There's 2 C's in recycle. Recycle, maybe more. I don't know. I think there's 2 C's in recycle. I'm not a very good speller. So osteoclasts are going to be the recycling ones. So for this first, the first option here, it would be osteoblasts. And that second one would be this bone 1 here, would be osteoclasts. Osteoclasts recycle, therefore they are responsible for bone resorption. And our osteoblasts, they build, they are responsible for bone formation. So I hope my emails aren't showing up. I have got some pop-ups of my emails. Anyway, I hope this helps the understanding of what you got wrong, because you may see these questions again in the near future. Bye.